Hello and welcome to Conversation With, where I speak with organizations that work on Europe and on issues that pertain to all of us, all European citizens. Today I'm talking to Matthew Bach, who is Regional Director for Europe at ICLEI, which is a global network of local and regional government that's committed to sustainable urban development, which means supporting local governments in their ambition to transition to climate neutrality in the end. So welcome, Matthew. It's a pleasure to have you here. What we will be talking about is the next EU budget, which is what the EU calls the multi-annual financial framework, or short MFF. It's a bit of a mouthful, and how it reforms the way that local and regional governments handle EU funds. This budget is really, really important. It's the 7-year budget, which funds everything that the EU does within these 7 years. The current one is expiring, and the new one is set to be in place from 2028 to 2034. The Commission proposed a plan for the multi-annual financial framework a few months ago, and in its plan, it should be over 2 trillion euros big. So quite a lot of money that will go to the European institution. Although if you compare it to national budgets, it is still not outrageously high. So, Matthew, what I want to talk to you about is how this proposal and how the MFF actually funds local governments, which are, I think, for many of us as European citizens, the closest level, how we actually feel a governance in our lives. So, for people who aren't really familiar with how the budget works, how the MFF works, could you tell us a little bit about what the Commission's plan is, how the EU usually funds local governments, and why that is important?
Sure, and it's really great to be with you, Julius. So you've actually mentioned a few of the key points already. I think the 2 trillion figure is one that's important. But what's also important is that actually, if we look at the EU's gross national income, it's actually just over 1% of it. So over 7 years, not really that outrageous if we think about it. But why is it so important? Well, it's because it pools basically all the financial resources from member states so that we can achieve our long-term goals. And so here we're talking about everything from climate neutrality through competitiveness, digitalization, cohesion, and so on and so forth. So in essence, this is really the strategic decision par excellence, because it's not actually just about money. It's a misnomer to think that it's just a budget. And it's about our strategic direction, where we as Europe move forward and which transitions we empower, which actors we empower. And so I think you also mentioned that there is this risk in terms of for the local and regional governments and the current proposals from the Commission. And I think what's important to highlight here is that the Commission is proposing merging a whole number of EU funds into 27 national plans, all currently known as national regional partnership plans, but basically centralized plans. And it comes from a good place. So, of course, we understand the desire and the need to simplify a little bit of how the EU works, to reduce administrative burdens and so on. But at the same time, the reality is that without including mandatory regional and territorial chapters in these plans, we will have a very dysfunctional union that will not provide the support needed at the local and regional level across the EU. And I think, especially when we think about the fact that it's cities, towns, and regions who are ultimately implementing all of this EU legislation on the ground, if they don't have a role in deciding how all this money is structured, and beyond that, if they don't have a role in deciding what the priorities are and how they can access this funding, then we're definitely going to a bad place, basically. So I think we really need to ensure that local knowledge comes into these decision-making, that there's in essence, territorial balance on how we reach our climate, digital, and social goals, and that we also learn from some of the mistakes that we've made. And so here I actually would like to give you an example, because if we look at the COVID era Recovery and Resilience Facility, we've gone back and looked at it.
Which was the fund that the EU proposed or implemented after the COVID pandemic, right?
Exactly, yes. And it
Improve the
was
burden.
absolutely, and it was meant to try to restart everything. And so there was a lot of good in it. So I'm not here to criticize that. But what the problem is really that so almost half of locally elected representatives reported minimal to no involvement in preparing funding projects. And that is a major issue because if we're talking about now 2 trillion on the table and we have no involvement or consultation from local or regional governments, then we're all facing a much larger issue in terms of not just implementability of the initiatives, but ultimately also risk harming good initiatives that we would like to do to act on climate, innovation, and resilience.
Right. Could you give me an example concretely? Let's say I'm a municipality, a local government in Germany. How do I access EU funds at the moment, and how would that be different under this current proposal, the current plan by the Commission for the EU budget?
Germany's a bit of a complex case, to be honest. But what I'd give you instead, actually, rather, is I think there's a good case to look at how things are being done in Sweden, because I think that's in northern Sweden, basically, they've been very good at looking how to accelerate their green industrial transition much faster than in the rest of Europe, including Germany particularly. And so this has to do with the Nordbotten region, where they've gotten around 18 billion in private investment since 2030, a lot of it on fossil fuel-free steel, on hydrogen production, sustainable mining, and so on and so forth. And so they've really managed to become Europe's leading clean tech hub here. And what is particularly interesting here is that they've been able to then combine this kind of public and private finding, and at the same time to basically grow then the infrastructure that they need to grow their own industry. So we're talking about massive amounts of electricity expansion, building tens of thousands of new homes, and so on and so forth. And I think this is both a way of showing the importance of territorial investments on the one hand, but on the other hand, it's showing what's possible if we put a region in the driver's seat here. But beyond that, to come back to your initial question, how these different EU funds are accessed, I think what we're talking about ultimately is a thicket of different funding applications, programs. You have so there's the whole cohesion things with the RDF funds. There are which are then go through the regional governments. There's then cities can then access Horizon Europe funds, so the research and innovation funds. There are so many different bits and pieces, and I think that's the key point here: bits and pieces. And it's very time consuming and very challenging, especially for smaller municipalities to deal with this. And so I think that is then where we agree that there needs to be some measure of simplification, but at the same time, it needs to be simplified in a way that it responds to the needs of not just the local governments, but also local populations, and that they move forward together. And I think that's really the critical point here. And there's no way around this kind of territorial approach if we want to be successful.
Yeah, I see. Does this also mean that in this new plan, in this new proposal, municipalities, regions that are maybe at odds with national governments and with national government spending priorities, that in this case, if this was to go forward, that these regions and municipalities would not be able to access the EU funds because it would all go through, let's say, a national government plan? Is that what you fear as well?
It certainly is one of the things that we fear, and I think we haven't really had our demands met in this regard. I think it's really critical that any future EU budget, regardless of its exact structure and components, has proper safeguarding mechanisms in place to ensure local access to funds if there are issues in terms of national level governance. Because, for example, the citizens of one city should certainly not pay a price for the decisions taken at a national level. And I think this is a very important principle that does need to be adopted in all these negotiations, but we're definitely not there yet. Yeah, and there are
Yeah.
certainly other points that we can raise here as well.
Yeah, I see. Now, local governments implement, I think, 70% of EU Green Deal legislation and are responsible for a similar amount for climate-related public spending. What do they provide that national governments can't and don't?
Well, that's a really good question. And I think it's the key point here is that local and regional governments, they are the level closest to citizens. Not just are they closest, they're also the most trusted level. So especially at a time when we see questions about where our democracies are going, about trust in our institutions, the local level is very much the place where citizens trust their institution, feel connected to them, and where they also see an ability to carry things out. So I think the truth is that it's the local and regional level that turns all these EU rules and projects and initiatives and all that, whether we're talking about renovating buildings, transforming mobility, renewables, social services, all of this at the end of the day is implemented in a town, a city, or a region. And even though the national government will set broad frameworks, it's the cities and regions that really do this on the ground work. And they're the ones then driving Europe's innovation, competitiveness, and cohesion. And I think these are really critical points that if Europe, more broadly speaking, wants to meet the goals that it has, we need to ensure that then the cities and regions are empowered. And so this is all about basically making EU priorities reality for people at the end of the day.
Yeah. Could you tell me some other instances than climate? We talked about the Green Deal just now. What are other places and areas where local governments are just better at spending than national governments are?
Well, I think there are many different potential areas here. One of them is definitely on the side of well, social delivery, social programs. I think we see local governments having a real leadership role there in terms of the actual delivery of social support to their citizens. Of course, at ICLEI, we focus primarily on the environmental, climate, and this broader sustainability side of things. But you know, if you think about a local government, they are also the ones in many cases also providing the school meals to school children, and so they're able to make key decisions here in terms of what these meals are, both in terms of their health impacts, but also their environmental impacts. Are we talking about good, sustainable food, or are we talking about basically junk food? These are just micro examples, but I think that's the challenge that a local government faces, that at the end of the day, they are responsible for so many different areas with such limited capacity that they really need all these other levels of government to line up and work with them in partnership as they're supposed to in real effective multi-level governance.
Yeah, I see. Now, you at ICLEI, you're not the only ones that have criticized the Commission's plan. Agriculture lobbies are also mad. The European Parliament actually got some concessions from the Commission after quite some pressure. And obviously, the Commission's plan is only the first in a series of negotiations that will probably last for the next year, for the next 1.5 years. So definitely for still quite some time. What do you see as first the next step? Do you think that the Commission, which has already moved on, at least when it comes to agriculture, also being centralized in national plans, is that already a step in the right direction? Does that fulfill your demands? And more broadly, what do you see as the next step for the MFF?
Yeah, well, I think we need to be clear that we're certainly still a very long way from the finish line. So there will be many more interesting and surprising developments as we progress. But it is worth noting, of course, that the Commission is to an extent recognizing the concerns raised by cities and regions. And so I think the fact that they're having stronger references now to the partnership principle and to multi-level governance, this is, I think we would call it a good starting. It's a step in the right direction, but we are definitely not there yet because we still need to ensure the meaningful participation of the local and regional levels, even if in cases where the national government fails to do what they have to do. And so there's a lot of work that we're doing with our partners, for example, in the local alliance, which brings together the key European city networks. But I think some of the key demands that we have that are not really met for now, as for example, we have to make the national these regional and territorial chapters mandatory in the national plans. You cannot have a member state that just says, "Oh well, we're just going to do this kind of voluntarily on our own." This is not a way to do things, especially when you have electoral cycles, governments changing, and you cannot necessarily predict. We talked about the safeguarding mechanism that's needed also to prevent broader issues. But then also there are things like we need dedicated funding for cities of all sizes. And I think we're somewhat worried about some of these programs being diluted into broader other categories which don't help. There are also issues like we need some clear earmarking on just transition, biodiversity, sustainable urban development overall in terms of the investments that are needed. There are a lot of areas that don't really have a proper place in the current structure. And the problem with not having a clear place in these structures is that they fall through the cracks. And particularly in the case of just transition, this would be very, well, problematic in the sense that the Commission and the EU more broadly has invested so much in this whole area through the just transition mechanism, the fund, and so on and so forth. And the work that they've started is by no means finished. There's much more to do. But ultimately, we need to ensure that cities and regions are key beneficiaries for most of the items that are put into this budget, because then they will have a role at the end of the day in terms of actually delivering things to citizens. And otherwise, we create a budget that's unimplementable and that doesn't really deliver what it needs to for citizens.
Maybe my final question would be, what is your biggest worry when you look forward and when you look ahead in the next 1.5, 2 years that it will still take until we have the final version of the budget? What is your biggest worry, and what will be the moment where you say, okay, your campaigning has been successful?
I think it's hard to say that there's just one biggest worry. I think,
or then multiple if you have.
I think that the messages that we're bringing forward to the Commission, to the Parliament, to the Council, and so on, these messages from all the networks are quite coherent and are quite clear in terms of what needs to be done for things to work. And I think our biggest worry is that in the negotiations and the horse trading that happens to actually get a budget, that there's too much compromising on some of these key points, and that in the effort to reach a compromise agreement, to be able to actually pass the budget, that we lose the important elements and that we lose sight collectively of what needs to be done as a union to move forward. Because I think we're talking about 7 years here. This is a significant chunk of time, and Europe has the potential in these 7 years to really move forward on so many fronts, but it also has the potential to backslide and not deliver. And I think that is the very real risk that we have to be crystal clear about. So I think, does that keep us up at night? Well, somewhat, but we have to pace ourselves because we've got quite some time ahead of us. And then the kind of the reverse to that, which is how do we judge our success in this regard? I think I have to be clear that success in this case is the accumulation of so many individual actions that it's actually very challenging to say, oh, well, we put this word into this text, for example. So yes, of course, we can propose amendments, and we can and will do that. We can talk to the legislators, to the different parties. Absolutely, we can and will do that. But at the end of the day, it's this kind of movement-wide engagement that delivers. And I think that's what we saw already when the Commission announced these initial changes to their initial proposals. And I think that's what we'll keep seeing, because we'll keep being able to collectively bring forward these messages and to shape a future within the MFF, but of course without it as well, that responds and corresponds also to the needs of cities and regions and towns.
Thank you very much. Is there something that you would still like to add, something that you feel like we haven't touched upon enough?
Well, I think I would just emphasize that there's an idea that, I mean, so there's a lot of talk about subsidiarity, for example. And there's this idea that
Could you just explain that what that is to our people
exactly
that don't know that?
So that each level of government is responsible for certain things, and then the next level should then basically the higher level should not deal with with things dealt with by the lower levels. Essentially, it means the EU is not supposed to stick its nose into too many things that member states and others take care of, which is all well and good. But I think we should not use that as an excuse to overlook the fact that the EU and EU funds have a critical role in shaping our cities and towns, and that at the end of the day, they do so much. So, for example, like, let me try to be more concrete here. We have the Social Climate Fund, which is about going to become operational. This has a real potential to help drive support to vulnerable populations all across the EU who are struggling with basically the impacts of the green transition. And if we use this tool effectively to really support them and to make the investments that we need in terms of energy efficiency for them and giving them what they need, it's really going to help from everything from clean mobility schemes, energy poverty programs, local infrastructure upgrades, and so it's going to deliver on the ground. The problem again is we have, in most of the plans that have been delivered by the member states, very little involvement of cities and regions. And again, we have then this disconnect. So kind of what I think we can not emphasize enough in this context, whether it's purely MFF or more broadly, is we know how to make all this work successfully through the involvement and the co-design of the different levels of governance. And it's only in that way that we're going to get there. And I think we've got a positive signal today from the Commission when they've just published their EU cities agenda, which says very clearly that they want continuous dialogue at technical and political levels. And I think these are the points that we need to push forward collectively and develop, so that when the EU is deciding something, it's not just the EU, of course, it's the EU with the member states and with their corresponding national and regional government, regional and local governments.
Thank you very much, Matthew. That was a pleasure.